In a quiet suburban neighborhood, nestled among rows of neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences, there lived a boy named Caleb. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. He was 17, tall for his age, and had that comfortable ease that came from a life without struggle. His family was well off, and his world was simple: school, sports, weekends spent with friends. Caleb's friends were good guys, but they didn't think much about the world outside their small circle. They joked about things, teased each other about their parents, their teachers, and occasionally, the people they saw on the streets. Caleb went along with it, never really questioning, never really caring. He was content, but there was something in the air, a feeling he couldn't place. He didn't know it yet, but this feeling would soon change everything. One cold autumn afternoon, Caleb was walking home from school. The path home took him through the town park, a place that seemed as ordinary as the rest of the neighborhood. The trees had started shedding their leaves, and the crisp air made him zip up his jacket. As he walked past the old wooden bench, something caught his eye. There, sitting on the bench, was a man, a black man, dressed in tattered clothes, his face lined with age and hardship. His eyes seemed distant, as if he had seen too much and wanted nothing more than to be left alone. Caleb hesitated. His footsteps slowed as he passed the bench. He noticed the man's shoes were worn and his coat had holes. A glance at his face revealed years of struggle and solitude. For a moment, Caleb thought about continuing on, about ignoring the man as most people did. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way the man's eyes seemed to plead for help, or maybe it was the way his heart tugged, small but insistent. Caleb took a deep breath, gathered his courage, and stopped. "Hi," Caleb said awkwardly, unsure what to say. The man looked up slowly, his gaze steady. Caleb's stomach twisted, unsure of what kind of response to expect. "Hey there," the man said in a gravelly voice. He paused, and for a moment, the two of them just stood there. Caleb with his awkward nervousness and the man with a weary calm. I have a sandwich if you're hungry," Caleb offered, his voice suddenly feeling too loud in the quiet of the park. The man's eyes flickered for a second, then he nodded slowly. "You're kinda offer, kid. Thanks." And so, Caleb sat down beside him, awkwardly handing the man the sandwich he'd brought for himself. They shared the quiet of the afternoon. Caleb had questions, so many questions, but he didn't ask. Instead, they simply sat in the shared silence of two people who had no idea what this moment would mean. The next day, Caleb found himself walking back to the park. He hadn't planned to, but he felt an urge to check on the man again. Something about him lingered in Caleb's thoughts, an unease he couldn't quite shake. When Caleb reached the bench, the man was there, as if waiting. He looked up as Caleb approached and nodded with recognition. "You back again?" the man asked, a faint, weary smile on his lips. Caleb nodded, feeling self-conscious. "I just wanted to see if you were okay." The man chuckled, a low, raspy sound. "Okay is a big word, but I'm still here, so I guess that's something." Caleb sat down beside him again, unsure of what to say next. There was an awkward silence before the man spoke again. "You know, kid, people don't often stop to ask how I'm doing." The man's eyes were distant again, as if recalling memories long buried. "They walk by like I'm invisible. Some even cross the street to avoid me." Caleb glanced at him, confused. "Why?" The man shrugged, a tired gesture. "You'd be surprised what people are afraid of. It's not just the looks, or the dirt, or the smell. It's the fear. Fear of what they don't understand." "Fear," Caleb repeated, thinking about it. "But you're just a person." "Exactly," the man said with a nod. "But some people forget that. They see the clothes, the skin, the situation, and suddenly, you ain't a person anymore. You're a problem." Caleb swallowed, feeling the weight of his words. He wasn't sure how to respond, so he simply nodded, trying to process this new world he had never considered. His life had been so different from this man's, yet for some strange reason, Caleb felt like he could understand a little bit more now. Over the next few days, Caleb returned to the park. At first, The visits were awkward, but slowly, they became more comfortable. They started talking more about small things like the weather and sports, but then about bigger things too. Jeremiah, as the man had introduced himself, talked about his past, his job as a teacher, and how his life had spiraled after he lost everything. "I had a family once," Jeremiah said one day, his voice quieter than usual, "but things got tough. Lost my job, couldn't pay the bills, and soon enough, I was out on the streets." Caleb listened intently, feeling the sharp contrast between his own life and Jeremiah's. He realized that the man wasn't just some stranger on the street. He was a person with a story, with dreams, with a past. "So, what happened?" Caleb asked cautiously, unsure how much to pry. Jeremiah sighed, looking up at the sky. "Systems broken, kid. You can do everything right, but if you ain't got the right connections, the right skin, or the right address, you ain't got a chance. It's a tough world." Caleb didn't have the words to respond. He'd never really thought about it that way. When Caleb returned home that night, he was quiet, distracted. His parents noticed immediately. "Something wrong?" his mother asked as Caleb sat at the dinner table. Caleb hesitated, his thoughts spinning. "I met a man today, a homeless man." His father, who had been reading the newspaper, looked up sharply. "Homeless man," he said, his voice flat, almost dismissive. "Well, that's where they belong." Caleb looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" His father shrugged. "It's just the way things are. You can't help them all, Caleb. They're just people who can't get their act together. You shouldn't be wasting your time on them." Caleb's heart sank. He didn't want to argue, but the words stung. He didn't understand. How could his father think that way? How could he dismiss a person like that so easily? But Caleb kept quiet, unwilling to stir up trouble. He picked at his food, his thoughts still back at the park, with Jeremiah. The next day at school, Caleb's friends teased him about his visits to the park. "What, you helping out the homeless now?" his best friend, Jake, mocked. "Maybe next, you'll invite him over for dinner." The laughter stung, but Caleb said nothing. He had learned early on to keep quiet when it came to disagreements with his friends. But today was different. Today, something had changed inside him. He thought about Jeremiah, about his kindness, his wisdom, his resilience. And it made Caleb's friends' words feel hollow, like the empty noise they were. Later, as Caleb walked home, he passed the park again. He saw Jeremiah sitting on the bench, looking up at the sky as if he could see something Caleb couldn't. Caleb didn't hesitate this time. He walked up, sat down beside Jeremiah, and simply said, "I brought you some food." Jeremiah smiled faintly. "You sure know how to make an old man feel like he's worth something." And for the first time, Caleb felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. The days following his conversation with his parents left Caleb with a gnawing discomfort. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with his father's dismissive attitude toward people like Jeremiah. Caleb wasn't sure if it was guilt or confusion, but he started noticing more and more how the people around him treated those who were different. At school, Caleb couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation. His classmates using racial slurs, making jokes about black people they saw on the news, talking about the problem of homelessness like it was something that could be solved by ignoring it. Caleb felt uncomfortable, like a stranger in his own world. He tried to shake it off, but it was harder now. Every time someone made a joke about race, he felt his stomach twist. He couldn't unhear the words. And now, Jeremiah's face was always in the back of his mind. One afternoon, Caleb met his friends at the local coffee shop after school. As they gathered around the table, someone brought up the topic of homelessness. "I saw this homeless guy in the park the other day," Jake, his best friend, said with a laugh. "I guess he was asking for money. But honestly, I just walked right past him. No way I'm giving my hard-earned cash to someone like that." Caleb's jaw clenched, and he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "I saw the same guy," Caleb said carefully. "His name's Jeremiah. He's not just some random guy. He used to be a teacher." Jake rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, Caleb. You can't seriously think people like that are worth your time." The others around the table nodded in agreement, their expressions hardening into indifference or outright disdain. "It's not about the guy," one of them chimed in. "It's about the system, man. You can't fix everything, and people like that. He's just lazy." Caleb felt the heat rise in his face. He wanted to scream, to tell them how wrong they were, how much he was learning about the world outside his bubble. But instead, he sat in silence, the words caught in his throat. Jake noticed his discomfort and smirked. "What? You're going soft on us now, Caleb? You're gonna start helping every loser you meet?" Caleb felt the sting of their words, but he didn't back down. "It's not like that," he said quietly. "He's not a loser. He's just in a tough spot." His friend scoffed, and the conversation moved on. But Caleb could feel a rift growing between him and the people he had always been close to. They didn't see what he was starting to see, and that hurt more than anything. The next day, Caleb returned to the park. He had been thinking about the conversation with his friends all day, and it weighed on him. His steps were heavy as he approached the bench where he usually found Jeremiah. When Caleb arrived, he saw the man sitting alone, staring into the distance. As always, there was something dignified about him, despite his situation. Caleb sat down beside him, unsure of how to start the conversation. "Hey, Jeremiah," Caleb said after a long pause. "How's it going?" Jeremiah looked up, a small smile appearing on his face. "Same as always, kid. Same as always." There was a long pause before Caleb spoke again. I don't understand. How did this happen to you?" Jeremiah let out a deep sigh and leaned back on the bench, his eyes squinting against the sunlight. "Life's not always fair. I had a good job, a family, but there are things you can't control, things outside your reach. You can fight, but sometimes the system is bigger than you. It's not about being lazy. It's about trying to survive a world that wasn't made for you." Caleb sat quietly, trying to absorb what Jeremiah had just said. He thought about his own life, about his home, his school, his future, and how simple it all seemed in comparison. The disparity was jarring. Later that afternoon, Caleb's mother asked him to run an errand at the grocery store. Caleb didn't mind. It was an excuse to get out of the house. As he was walking through the aisles, he overheard a conversation between two women standing near the frozen food section. "Have you seen all the black people moving into this area?" one of the women said. "It's really ruining the neighborhood. All these criminals moving in. It's like they're everywhere." Caleb's stomach dropped. He stood frozen for a moment, unable to move. He knew the women weren't talking about Jeremiah. They were talking about people like him. "Honestly," the other woman responded, "they don't belong here. We're just lucky they don't cause too much trouble. But who knows how long that will last." The words stung, and Caleb wanted to step forward, to say something, anything. But the shock of hearing that kind of blatant prejudice left him paralyzed. Instead, he turned and quickly walked away, but the words echoed in his mind. When he got home, he couldn't focus on anything else. He realized that the world he had taken for granted was built on assumptions he had never questioned. That evening, Caleb couldn't keep it in any longer. He found his father in the living room, reading a newspaper. "Dad," Caleb started, his voice more serious than usual, "I don't understand why you talk about people like that. Why do you think Jeremiah, or anyone, deserves to be treated that way?" His father looked up from his paper, eyebrows raised. "Treated that way? Caleb, you don't get it. People like that bring trouble. They're not like us. They don't fit in." Caleb's heart raced as he stood there. He wanted to yell, to argue, but he forced himself to stay calm. "People like you and me," Caleb said, trying to choose his words carefully, "don't even have to think about how hard life is for people like Jeremiah. We don't have to fight just to survive." His father scoffed. "You're too idealistic, Caleb. You're young. You don't know how the world really works. They make their own choices, and they live with the consequences." Caleb stared at his father, the growing realization that he couldn't just accept his father's views anymore settling heavily on him. For the first time, Caleb felt the gulf between them, the widening divide that he wasn't sure how to bridge. The next day at school, Caleb found himself even more isolated. His friends no longer seemed like the people he had grown up with. They were different now, their words cutting through him. He was no longer sure where he fit in. As he walked through the hallways, he passed by a bulletin board with a flyer announcing a town meeting about the increasing homelessness in the area. The flyer said the issue was becoming unacceptable and that the community needed to take action. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that the community wasn't talking about helping people like Jeremiah. They were talking about pushing them out, hiding them, pretending they didn't exist. That evening, after dinner, Caleb went back to the park. He needed to talk to Jeremiah, to make sense of everything he was feeling. As he arrived, he saw the familiar figure sitting alone on the bench, and for the first time, Caleb felt a sense of solidarity. "Jeremiah," Caleb said, sitting down beside him, "I don't know what to do. My friends, my family, they don't see it the way I do. I don't know how to explain it." Jeremiah turned his head slowly and gave Caleb a long, considering look. "You don't need to explain it, Caleb," he said softly. "You just need to listen. Listen to what's being said around you. Watch how people treat each other. And then, you do what you can to make it better, even if it's hard, especially if it's hard." For the first time, Caleb understood what Jeremiah meant. This wasn't just about helping one man. It was about changing the way people saw the world. And he realized, in that moment, that his journey was just beginning. As Caleb walked home that night, his mind was clearer than it had ever been. He had never felt so conflicted, yet so certain of his path. He knew what he needed to do. He couldn't stay silent anymore. He had to stand up. He had to speak out. Caleb didn't know what the future held, but he knew that helping Jeremiah was just the first step in something much larger. He wasn't going to let the world tell him who deserved compassion, and that was just the beginning. The following week, Caleb found himself increasingly disturbed by the conversations swirling around him. Every day at school, the jokes and comments about Black people, about the homeless, continued. It was as if no one cared enough to change, or even think differently. But Caleb couldn't stay silent anymore. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that something had to change. He couldn't let his friends think this was just normal. One afternoon, Caleb returned to the park to find Jeremiah sitting on the bench. The air was cold, the sky gray, and Caleb noticed the old man seemed even more tired than usual. "Jeremiah," Caleb said softly, sitting beside him, "I've been thinking a lot. About everything. About how people treat you and others like you." Jeremiah looked over at him, his tired eyes filled with quiet understanding. "Yeah?" he said, leaning back. "What's been on your mind?" Caleb hesitated, then spoke with newfound resolve. "I think it's time I do something about it. I don't know exactly what, but I can't keep ignoring it. People like you, people who are homeless, people who are Black, people who've been pushed to the margins, they deserve better. And I'm not going to just let it keep going." Jeremiah studied Caleb's face, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Then, finally, Jeremiah spoke. "It's a tough world, Caleb. You think you can change it? It's going to cost you something." "I'm ready," Caleb said firmly. "I won't stand by anymore." The next day at school, Caleb made a decision. He printed a flyer. It wasn't much, just a simple, bold message that read, "Homelessness and racism are problems we need to address. Let's make our community better, together." He taped the flyers around the school campus, on lockers, bulletin boards, and even the walls near the cafeteria. He didn't expect much of a response, but when he returned the next morning, the flyers had been torn down. And this time, they weren't just discarded. They were deliberately shredded. Caleb found one of the pieces of the flyer in his locker, crumpled up and thrown carelessly on the floor. The words, "Get out of here, you traitor," were scrawled on it in marker. His stomach dropped. For a moment, he thought about stopping, but then he remembered Jeremiah's words. It was going to cost him something. By the end of the week, things at school had become increasingly tense. Caleb's friends, his old friends, started confronting him. "You really think you can change anything?" Jake said one morning before class. "You're just some kid with a stupid idea, and now you're siding with them? You've got a lot of nerve." The words stung, but Caleb refused to back down. "What's so wrong with trying to make things better? If you can't see it, Jake, then you're part of the problem." "Don't give me that," Jake sneered. "You're embarrassing yourself. You're becoming just like those people." "Like what people?" Caleb asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "Like people who care about others?" Jake laughed harshly. "No, like people who think they can change the world. You're not going to fix anything, Caleb. You're just making a fool of yourself." The group of friends gathered around, nodding in agreement, their disapproval obvious. Caleb stood tall, though his heart was pounding. "Maybe I am making a fool of myself, but at least I'm trying." He turned and walked away, leaving his friends behind. But the sting of their words stayed with him. The tension between Caleb and his peers grew as the days passed. The situation came to a head when Caleb's history teacher, Mr. Johnson, led a class discussion about the history of race relations in America. As the conversation began, Caleb could feel the familiar discomfort in the air. Mr. Johnson was well-meaning but passive, and the discussion quickly turned into a debate where most of the students simply repeated the same tired arguments. "That's the way it's always been," one student said. "We can't change it now." Another chimed in. "Black people have been fighting for equality forever. What's the point?" Caleb felt the rage building inside him. This was what he had been fighting against, the dismissal of generations of struggle and pain. He couldn't stay silent anymore. Not now. He raised his hand, his voice shaky but determined. "That's not true," Caleb said. "We can change things. It starts with us. It starts with people like you and me standing up and saying enough is enough. If we don't act now, nothing will ever change." The class went silent. Caleb felt everyone's eyes on him, some with confusion, others with hostility, but he stood his ground. Mr. Johnson tried to redirect the conversation, but Caleb could see the subtle nods of approval from a few students, those who had been quietly agreeing with him. It was a small victory, but it felt like a win nonetheless. At home that night, Caleb's father confronted him. He had heard about the incident at school and was furious. "You embarrassed me today, Caleb," his father spat, his voice hard. "This whole town, this country, is built on hard work, on people who pull themselves up. You're just making a fool of yourself. You're acting like there's something wrong with people who've worked hard and earned their place." Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't hold back anymore. "I'm making a fool of myself, Dad, but that doesn't mean I'm wrong. People like Jeremiah, like the people in this town who don't get a fair shot, they don't have the same opportunities. They don't get the same breaks." His father stared at him, eyes narrow with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know anything about the real world." "I know that things can be better," Caleb said, his voice shaking but resolute. "I'm not going to sit back and pretend I don't see what's going on." His father scoffed. "You're wasting your time, and you're going to regret it." Caleb turned away, his fists clenched. He didn't want to hear any more. But deep down, he knew this was the beginning of something bigger, something he couldn't turn away from, even if it meant losing the approval of his father. Despite the tension at home and the backlash at school, Caleb continued visiting the park to see Jeremiah. The old man had become a quiet source of strength and wisdom. "You're doing good, Caleb," Jeremiah said one day, his voice gravelly but reassuring. "It's not easy to fight against the things people don't want to see, but you're on the right path. You're doing what's right." Caleb smiled, though it was tinged with uncertainty. "It doesn't feel like it. I feel like I'm losing everything. My friends, my dad, even people at school. I don't know if it's worth it." Jeremiah placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder, a comforting gesture. "Trust me, kid. It's worth it. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is the right thing. You just have to keep going. The people who matter will understand. And the ones who don't, they'll eventually come around. Or they'll fall away. Either way, you'll be better for it." Caleb nodded, taking comfort in Jeremiah's words. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. The path ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing. He couldn't turn back now. The following weekend, Caleb went to the community meeting about homelessness that was being held at the town hall. It was an open discussion about how to address the rising number of homeless people in the area, and Caleb knew this was his chance to speak out. As the meeting started, the room filled with people complaining about the problem in the town. They talked about keeping the homeless out of sight, about cleaning up the streets. Caleb stood up, his heart racing. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. "I'm Caleb," he said, his voice clear but shaking. "And I think we need to stop thinking of these people as problems. We need to start seeing them as people. People who deserve help. People who deserve a chance." There were murmurs in the room, but Caleb pressed on. "We can't keep pretending that the system is working. It's not. People like Jeremiah, they don't choose this life. They fall through the cracks. And if we don't do something, if we don't help, then we're just as guilty as the system that leaves them out in the cold." For a moment, the room was quiet. Then, one by one, people began to speak up, some in support, some against. But the conversation had shifted. Caleb had made his stand. As Caleb walked home from the meeting, his thoughts were a whirlwind. He had expected resistance, but he also knew he had started something. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a step in the right direction. He thought about Jeremiah, about his father, about the friends who no longer spoke to him. And in that moment, Caleb understood that standing up for what was right wasn't just about changing the world. It was about changing himself. And that, he realized, was the most important change of all. The day after the community meeting, Caleb arrived at school to find an unsettling atmosphere. Whispers filled the hallways, and a few students openly avoided him, giving him cold stares. As Caleb walked into his first class, he noticed a group of students from the meeting sitting together, glaring at him. Jake was at the center of the group, his eyes narrowing as Caleb approached. "Nice speech, Caleb," Jake said sarcastically, leaning back in his chair. "You really think you're going to change anything? You've got everyone talking, but it's not in the way you think. You've made yourself a target." Caleb's pulse quickened, but he held his ground. "I'm not trying to change everyone's mind. I'm just saying what's true. And if people don't like it, that's on them." Jake snorted. "You've got no idea what you're talking about. This is how it works. People like him." Jake jerked his thumb towards the hallway, where a black student was walking by. "They don't belong in our world. You're making yourself look like a fool." The word stung, but Caleb refused to let them show. He was tired of the easy dismissal, tired of hearing that people who weren't like him didn't belong. He straightened his back. "I don't care what you think, Jake. I'll keep fighting for what's right." Jake sneered and turned away, but the feeling of isolation settled deeper in Caleb's chest. As the week went on, Caleb's life became increasingly uncomfortable. At lunch, he noticed groups of students who used to be friendly with him now giving him the cold shoulder. They didn't speak to him. They didn't make eye contact. His phone buzzed less and less with messages, and his social media was flooded with negative comments. A hashtag Caleb is a woke joke, began circulating among the students. Caleb saw it spread like wildfire. His phone pinged with notifications as people posted memes mocking his activism and his outspokenness about racial equality. One evening, after another tiring day at school, Caleb sat on the porch, staring blankly at his phone. His father walked past, giving him a sharp look. "You see what you've done, Caleb?" His father's voice was low, almost disappointed. "You're stirring up trouble, and now everyone knows who you really are. The town's small, son. You can't just go around saying things like that and not expect backlash." Caleb slammed his phone down on the porch table. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be the guy who's making noise, but I can't stay quiet anymore. People like Jeremiah, people like the ones who've been treated like dirt for years, need someone to speak for them." His father didn't respond, but Caleb could see the anger simmering in his eyes. The rift between them was widening, but Caleb couldn't pretend it didn't exist anymore. This fight had become too important. As the pressure mounted, Caleb found himself questioning everything. He missed his old friends. He missed the easy days when he didn't have to think about racism, classism, or homelessness. One evening, as he sat with Jeremiah on the park bench, the weight of his isolation and the backlash hit him hard. "Jeremiah, am I doing the right thing?" Caleb asked, his voice small. "It's like everything I've known is crumbling. My friends, my family, they don't understand what I'm trying to do. I feel like I'm losing everyone." Jeremiah looked at him, his old eyes soft with understanding. You're not losing anyone, Caleb. Not really. The people who matter will always be there. It's the ones who can't see past their own narrow view. They'll drift away. But don't let them make you second-guess yourself. Caleb shook his head. But it's not just the people who don't agree with me. It's the loneliness. It's the feeling like I'm out here alone, yelling into the wind. Jeremiah smiled gently. You're not alone. Not yet, anyway. And as for the wind, you might not be able to change it all in one day, but even a small gust can make a difference. Just keep blowing, kid. Caleb felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. He wasn't sure how, but he knew he had to keep going. The next day at school, Caleb found a note tucked into his locker. It was a piece of paper, torn and folded in half, with only a few words written on it in bold, angry letters. Keep your mouth shut, or else. The threat was vague, but it sent a chill down Caleb's spine. He couldn't ignore it. Someone didn't want him speaking out, and they were willing to make that clear. At first, he thought about telling a teacher or his parents, but something inside him held him back. He didn't want to be seen as weak, as someone who couldn't handle the heat. But as the day went on, Caleb noticed a few strange glances, whispered conversations behind his back. He couldn't shake the feeling that the threat wasn't empty, that someone might be watching him. The situation at school worsened when Caleb was called to the principal's office. Caleb, Principal Carter said in his office, his voice firm, we've received numerous complaints about your behavior. Your actions are causing a disruption to the school's environment. You've been organizing protests, speaking out against your peers, and generally encouraging behavior that isn't in line with the values of this school. Caleb blinked, taken aback. What? I'm just standing up for what's right. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. The principal's face remained impassive. Whether or not that's your intention, Caleb, the reality is that your actions are causing tension. You're isolating yourself from your peers, and you're encouraging others to do the same. That's not acceptable here. Caleb's anger flared. So what? You're just going to shut me down because I don't agree with everyone else? Because I'm trying to make things better? Principal Carter sighed and leaned back in his chair. I'm not saying you can't have an opinion, Caleb, but this is a school. You're here to learn, not to push an agenda. You don't get it, Caleb snapped. I am learning. I'm learning that everything I've been taught, that this place, this town, has been built on things that are wrong. And I can't just pretend it's fine anymore. Principal Carter didn't respond, but the cold, distant look in his eyes told Caleb everything he needed to know. The real trouble began when a local news outlet picked up the story about Caleb's activism. They ran an article that focused on the controversy surrounding his actions. The headline read, Local teen causes uproar with pro-homeless, anti-racism campaign. The story highlighted Caleb's protests and his vocal stance against the community's treatment of the homeless, but it also framed him as a troublemaker and someone undermining local values. His face was splashed across the screen during local news broadcasts, accompanied by quotes from outraged community members. Caleb's phone was flooded with messages. Some were supportive, but many were hostile, angry, threatening, calling him a race traitor and a liberal idiot. The backlash didn't stop there. At the next town meeting, there were heated arguments about Caleb's behavior, and many voiced their anger at him for disrupting the community and making everyone uncomfortable. Caleb could feel the pressure mounting. The town was turning against him, and his resolve was beginning to crack. That evening, Caleb's father sat him down at the dinner table. His face was pale, and his expression was hard to read. You're making a huge mistake, Caleb, his father said, his voice quieter than usual. People are angry. You've gone too far this time. Caleb shook his head. You don't understand. I'm trying to make things better. I'm trying to do the right thing. His father sighed heavily. No, you're just causing chaos. You've turned against everything this family stands for. You're tearing us apart. The words hit Caleb harder than he expected. So what? You want me to just stop? To go back to being the same kid I was before? To pretend everything's fine when it's not? His father's face softened slightly. I'm not saying it's fine. I'm just saying that there are consequences. You can't fight everyone and expect to win. Caleb stood up. his hands clenched into fists. "I don't care about winning. I care about doing what's right." As the week came to a close, Caleb stood in front of his mirror. His reflection stared back at him, but he barely recognized the boy he saw. He was tired, worn out, and the weight of the world seemed to be pressing on his shoulders. But as the anger, the doubt, and the pressure swirled within him, Caleb made a decision. He was going to keep fighting. He was going to keep pushing for change, no matter what it cost him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but Caleb ignored it. He had bigger things to worry about now. He walked out the door, ready to face whatever was coming next. One evening, as Caleb walks home from a meeting with Jeremiah, he takes the usual shortcut through an alleyway behind the local grocery store. The streets are quiet, the air cool. But as Caleb turns the corner, he freezes. A group of masked figures steps out from the shadows. Their faces are obscured, but their intentions are clear. One of them steps forward, sneering. "You think you can change things around here? You think you're better than us, huh?" Before Caleb can respond, the figure shoves him against the brick wall. The others close in, surrounding him. Caleb's heart races as one of them pulls out a bottle, breaking it on the ground to create an intimidating jagged edge. "You're nothing but trouble, Caleb," another voice sneers. "Time for you to learn that people like you should keep their mouths shut." Fear grips Caleb, but something inside him refuses to back down. "I'm not going to stop. You can't scare me into silence." The figure with the broken bottle moves closer, but just as things seem about to escalate, a car engine roars to life. The figures scatter, running off into the night. Caleb breathes a shaky sigh of relief, heart still pounding in his chest. He didn't know who was driving, but it doesn't matter. The message had been made clear. His life was at risk. Later that night, Caleb meets with Jeremiah in the park again. His hands are still trembling as he sits beside the older man, recounting the incident. "They just wanted to scare me. They said I should keep quiet, that I'm causing problems." Jeremiah listens quietly, his eyes never leaving Caleb's face. After a long pause, he says, "You're causing a stir, Caleb. You've made your voice heard, and now they're trying to silence you. That's how it works. You stir the pot, and the pot fights back. But don't mistake fear for weakness. They want you to back down." "I don't know how much more of this I can take," Caleb admits, his voice strained. "They're going after me now, and I feel like I'm losing control, losing everything." Jeremiah places a weathered hand on Caleb's shoulder, his voice steady. "You've already made a difference, kid, but the fight isn't easy. No one ever said it would be. You've got to decide if you're willing to pay the price for the change you want to see. It's not about winning or losing. It's about whether you're willing to fight, no matter the cost." The next day, Caleb's father sits him down again, this time with a look that's a mixture of frustration and concern. "Caleb, what's going on? I heard about what happened last night. Are you trying to get yourself hurt?" Caleb's jaw tightens. "You don't understand, Dad. This isn't about just me. This is bigger than me. People like Jeremiah, people who are homeless, who've been treated like dirt. They need a voice. I can't just sit back and watch it happen anymore." His father's face hardens. "You don't understand, Caleb. You're playing with fire. You don't know what kind of people you're dealing with. The world doesn't change because of one kid with a few ideas. You're making enemies, real enemies. And now they're threatening you. You're putting us all at risk." "I'm already at risk, Dad," Caleb says, his voice rising. "By staying silent, I'm part of the problem. So, I'll keep speaking up, even if it costs me everything." His father's eyes narrow, disappointment radiating off him. "If you keep this up, you'll lose everything. Friends, family. You'll be alone." "Maybe that's what it takes," Caleb says, his voice quiet but firm. "Maybe it's the price I have to pay." His father stands up abruptly, walking out of the room without another word. Caleb sits, his chest tight with both fear and determination. The tension between them is palpable. He knows the path he's on will only push him further away from the family he loves, but he can't turn back now. At the next school board meeting, Caleb addresses the members in front of an audience of parents, teachers, and students. His voice shakes at first, but he gathers his courage. I've been trying to make this school, this town, a better place, Caleb says. But I've been told over and over that my actions are causing problems, that I'm making people uncomfortable. Well, I'm sorry, but I'd rather make people uncomfortable than let things continue the way they've always been. He takes a deep breath before continuing. There are people out there who don't have a voice, people who need help, and we can't keep pretending that everything is fine. We can't keep turning a blind eye to racism, to homelessness, to inequality. The few members of the audience clap, but there are others, parents and teachers, who murmur in disapproval. Caleb can feel the tension, but he doesn't let it faze him. I'm not asking for anyone's approval, Caleb concludes. I'm asking for action. Change isn't easy, but we can't keep ignoring what's happening right in front of us. If you're not willing to make the change, then you're part of the problem. As Caleb finishes, the room is silent for a long moment. He stands there, heart pounding, knowing the speech has made waves, just as it's created more enemies. The next day, Caleb's mother reaches out to him. She's seen the news, heard the reports, and been worried about him. Caleb, she says over the phone, her voice shaking, your father's right. I know you believe in what you're doing, but we're scared. This isn't safe. This town, this community, it's not going to change overnight. I know, Mom, Caleb replies, his voice soft, but I can't sit by and watch things stay the same. I can't just let it happen. I understand, honey, she says, but don't lose yourself in the process. Don't lose who you are. We love you, but we're scared of what this is doing to you. Caleb exhales, feeling the weight of her words. He doesn't want to alienate his family, but he knows they'll never fully understand his commitment to change. I'm still me, Mom, he says quietly, but I can't stay quiet anymore. The backlash continues, but it reaches new heights when a group of local business owners issues a public statement condemning Caleb's actions. The statement calls him a misguided teen who doesn't understand the real issues and urges the town to stand against this dangerous rhetoric. Caleb watches the statement on the news, his stomach sinking. He didn't expect this kind of organized pushback. The voices against him are growing louder, and the threat to his safety, to his family, is now more palpable. At school, things get worse. Caleb's locker is vandalized, and more threats are made against him. A few students taunt him in the hallway, and others make pointed remarks about his ridiculous crusade. The strain is overwhelming, but Caleb tries to stay focused. He has made a mark, and though it's coming at a steep price, he knows he can't stop now. One evening, Caleb is walking home from the park when he notices a black SUV parked near his house. The windows are tinted, and he can't make out who's inside. His instincts tell him something's wrong. As he walks closer to his driveway, the SUV suddenly pulls away, speeding off. Caleb's heart races as he looks around, wondering if he's being followed. He feels eyes on him, but there's no one around. He knows that the situation has escalated further, that his life is becoming more dangerous by the day. That night, Caleb sits alone in his room, staring out the window. His mind is racing with everything that's happened. Everything he's risked, everything he's lost, and everything he's still fighting for. He remembers the words Jeremiah told him weeks ago. The fight isn't easy, Caleb, but you gotta decide if you're willing to pay the price for the change you want to see. Caleb clenches his fists. He knows he's paid a heavy price already, but he also knows that there's no going back. This is who he is now, someone willing to fight for what's right, even if it means facing fear and losing everything. He stands up, resolute. Tomorrow, he will continue. The battle is far from over, but Caleb is ready for whatever comes next. It's a chilly morning when Caleb's phone rings. His mother's voice is shaky, frantic. Caleb, honey, your father. She struggles to get the words out. He had a heart attack. He's at the hospital. Caleb's world seems to stop. The phone slips from his hand, hitting the ground with a hollow thud. His heart races as he scrambles to grab his jacket and rush out the door. The weight of the phone call settling like a cold weight in his chest. At the hospital, Caleb rushes to the ER. He finds his mother in the waiting room, her face pale, eyes red from crying. She barely acknowledges him as he sits down beside her. They're doing everything they can, she whispers, clutching his hand. But, I don't know, Caleb. I don't know if he'll make it. Caleb stares at her, his mind racing. His father had never been a soft man. He'd always been distant, and their relationship had become more strained over the past few months. But the idea of losing him, of never getting the chance to make things right, hits Caleb like a punch to the gut. A doctor approaches and informs them that his father is stable for now, but it's too soon to tell if he'll recover fully. Caleb's relief is brief, and a quiet guilt creeps in. He wonders if his activism, his pushing away of everything and everyone around him, had contributed to this sudden and terrifying turn in his life. After several hours at the hospital, Caleb's father is moved to a room in the ICU. His mother insists that Caleb go home to rest, but Caleb can't bring himself to leave. He watches over his father, feeling the heavy weight of everything that has led to this moment. When they finally leave the hospital, Caleb's mother pulls him aside in the parking lot, her eyes filled with concern. "You need to stop, Caleb," she says, her voice firm but tired. "This fight you're on, it's tearing us apart. Your father's health, this could be on you. You've pushed him too far. You've pushed us too far. All of this battle you're fighting, it's costing you everything." Caleb shakes his head, frustration rising. "Mom, I'm not the one who caused this. I'm not the one who ignored the problems in this town. I'm just trying to make it better." His mother looks at him, her face softening. "I know, honey, but at what cost? What's it worth if you lose everything you love in the process?" "I can't stop now," Caleb whispers, his voice cracking. "People need to hear the truth. The system is broken, Mom." "I know," she says, her voice quiet now. "But sometimes the truth is too much to bear. Sometimes it's better to find peace instead of pushing for more pain." Caleb feels a pang of guilt, but he doesn't respond. How could he explain to her that peace wasn't an option when people like Jeremiah were still suffering? The weight of the world feels even heavier now. The next day, Caleb returns to school. The tension in the air is palpable. The local news reports that the protest Caleb organized last week has gained national attention. His name is now circulating widely, and not all of it is good. A group of parents and business owners have organized a rally against him, calling him an outsider, radical. At school, the environment is colder than ever. Caleb walks down the hall and notices that students who had once been his friends avoid eye contact, whispering behind his back. He overhears a conversation in the locker room, where Jake's voice rises above the others. "I don't know why Caleb's still acting like this. He's ruining everything," Jake says, laughing. "Who does he think he is?" Caleb feels the sting of betrayal. He'd been so focused on his activism, so sure of the importance of his cause, that he hadn't fully realized how alienating it had been to those around him. Now, his friends weren't just avoiding him. They were actively working against him. That afternoon, he sees a message on his social media. It's from someone he used to know, someone who had always been supportive of him in the past. The message is short and sharp. "You've gone too far. You're just as bad as the people you're fighting against. Maybe even worse." The words hang in his mind as he stares at his phone screen, the weight of everything starting to feel unbearable. Caleb walks home that afternoon, his head spinning from everything that's happened. His phone buzzes constantly with messages, angry, confused, and hurt. He feels alone. His activism, once the source of his passion and purpose, now feels like an insurmountable burden. As he walks past the park where he and Jeremiah used to meet, Caleb spots the older man sitting alone on the same bench. Jeremiah waves him over, but Caleb hesitates, unsure of what to say. "Hey," Caleb says, his voice strained. "I don't know if I can do this anymore." Jeremiah studies him for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. "The fight is never easy, Caleb, but you can't let the world tell you who you are. You have to decide that for yourself. Sometimes that means being willing to lose everything." "I don't know if I can lose any more," Caleb mutters, shaking his head. "I've lost my friends, my father's in the hospital, and the town wants to tear me apart. What's the point if it all just falls apart anyway?" Jeremiah looks at him with a mixture of compassion and sorrow. The point is that change doesn't come without sacrifice. The world is going to push you down, Caleb, but you have to decide if you're going to stay down or keep standing up. Caleb exhales, his shoulders heavy. For a moment, he considers giving it all up, quitting, apologizing to everyone, and retreating into the life he once knew. But deep down, he knows that he can't. I don't know if I'm strong enough, Caleb admits. Jeremiah nods slowly. Maybe not. But strength isn't about being invincible. It's about keeping going even when you feel like you can't anymore. Later that week, Caleb attends a rally organized by the opposing side, those who had spoken out against his activism. He didn't want to go, but something in him pushed him forward. If he was going to keep fighting, he needed to hear everything that was being said, even if it was painful. At the rally, Caleb finds himself surrounded by people shouting insults and angry chants. But among them, he notices someone else, a familiar face. One of the teachers from his high school, Mr. Rodriguez. The man locks eyes with Caleb from across the crowd. Caleb hadn't realized that Mr. Rodriguez shared his views until now. After the rally ends, Mr. Rodriguez approaches Caleb quietly. I see you, Caleb. I've seen what you've been doing, and I think you're on the right path. Caleb looks at him, surprised. I didn't think you'd be on my side after everything that's happened. Mr. Rodriguez shakes his head. It's not about sides. It's about doing what's right. And you're doing that, even if it's hard. You're showing people that there's a different way to see things. You're helping them understand that they can't just sit back anymore. Caleb nods slowly, a glimmer of hope returning to him. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. The day after the rally, Caleb goes to the hospital again to see his father. His father is awake, though still weak. Caleb sits by his side, unsure of how to begin. His father looks at him, his face tired but clear-eyed. I heard about what you're doing. The protests, the speeches. I didn't want to talk about it before, but I see now that you've made up your mind. Caleb swallows hard, unsure of his father's tone. I'm sorry, Dad. I know this hasn't been easy on you, on Mom, but I couldn't just stay silent anymore. Not with everything going on. His father sighs, the deep, heavy sound. I don't agree with what you're doing, Caleb, but I see you're committed to it. And I guess I respect that. Caleb looks at his father, his throat tight. I just want to make things better. You're doing it the hard way, son, his father says, his voice softening. But maybe that's the only way. Just don't lose yourself in it. Caleb nods, feeling the weight of his father's words. It isn't the approval he had wanted, but it's something that makes him believe that, maybe, he can still bridge the gap between the world he's fighting to change and the people he loves. Caleb stands alone at the edge of the park that evening, the sun setting behind him. His mind races with everything that's happened. The protests, the rallies, the isolation. He wonders if all of it was worth it, if the world was even ready for the kind of change he was trying to bring. His phone buzzes, and he looks down at a message from Jeremiah. Don't stop. You're doing the right thing. Caleb takes a deep breath. Maybe it's not about the world changing overnight. Maybe it's about setting the stage for change, even if it takes years. Maybe he's not meant to see the final result. Maybe, for now, it's enough to know that he's tried. The next morning, Caleb stands in front of his school. The crowd is smaller than it was before, but they are there, people who support him, who believe in the change he's fighting for. A few of his old friends have come around, offering hesitant but sincere support. Caleb speaks to them all. This fight isn't over. It won't be easy, but we can't stop now. We have to keep going. The crowd listens, and for the first time in weeks, Caleb feels the weight of the world lift just a little. He's not done yet. He's just getting started. The news breaks quickly. A video appears online. Caleb's own words, taken out of context, used against him. It's an edited clip from a speech he gave at a town hall, where he had been talking about systemic issues in his community. The video shows Caleb speaking passionately about fighting the system, but it's cut to imply he's calling for violence, for tearing down the existing order. The video spreads like wildfire across social media. Caleb watches in shock as his phone buzzes with notifications, angry comments, outraged posts. He tries to explain, but no one listens. The damage is done. At school, the reaction is swift. Caleb is cornered in the cafeteria by a group of students, led by Jake. "You said we should tear down the system," Jake accuses, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "What the hell does that mean, Caleb? Are you encouraging violence? Are you some kind of anarchist?" Caleb tries to explain, but the words catch in his throat. Everyone is staring at him. His friends, his classmates, even people he barely knows. He realizes too late that he's been caught in a trap, a moment where his words have been twisted, and now he has no way to undo it. "I didn't mean it like that," Caleb says, "but it feels like an empty defense." "You should have thought before you spoke," Jake retorts. "Look what you've done now. You've put us all in danger." The others murmur their agreement. Caleb feels the sting of betrayal. These were his friends, people he thought understood him. But now, they're all turning their backs. Later that night, Caleb's phone rings. It's his mother. "Caleb, what is going on? I'm getting calls from your school, from people in the neighborhood. They say you're inciting violence. I'm worried about you," she says, her voice trembling. "I didn't say that," Caleb protests, pacing his room. "They've edited the video. It's not what I meant." "But it's what they're hearing, Caleb," his mother says, her voice softer now, filled with concern. "And that's what matters. The town is angry. Your father. He's still not well, and now this?" "I know," Caleb says, guilt gnawing at him. "I never wanted this. I just wanted things to change." His mother is silent for a moment. "I understand, but you're not seeing the bigger picture, Caleb. You can't fight a war when you're this exposed. You're putting yourself and us at risk." The line goes quiet, and Caleb feels the weight of her words. He never wanted his family to suffer because of his choices, but in this moment, it feels like there's no way out. His activism, once a source of strength, has now become his undoing. Despite the backlash, Caleb knows he can't stop now. He goes to the park where some of the remaining supporters have gathered, people who still believe in his cause, who still want change. Jeremiah is there, as usual, sitting on the same bench, watching the group. Caleb approaches him hesitantly. "I don't know what to do anymore," Caleb says, his voice low. "The town's turning on me. My friends, they're turning on me. I'm losing everything, and it feels like I've done it all for nothing." Jeremiah looks at him with a deep, steady gaze. "Sometimes, kid, you lose things to find out who you really are. This world, it's going to try to break you. But you've got to decide, is it worth it? You've set something in motion that can't be undone, and that's the point. But it's all falling apart. I'm not sure I can keep fighting like this." Jeremiah chuckles softly, but it's not a laugh of amusement. It's a recognition of the weight Caleb carries. "You're not just fighting for yourself anymore, Caleb. You're fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. That's the truth. And when you fight for others, you don't get to pick when things get hard. It just is." Caleb looks at him, still unsure, but Jeremiah's words stick with him. Maybe this was bigger than him. Maybe, even in the chaos, there was a way forward. The pressure intensifies. Caleb's family insists that he make a public statement to clarify his position and undo the damage caused by the video. Reluctantly, he agrees. He stands before a group of reporters at a press conference organized by his school, knowing that the eyes of the entire town, perhaps even the state, are upon him. A reporter from a local news station asks the first question. "Caleb, there's been a lot of controversy surrounding your recent remarks. Can you clarify what you meant when you said you were going to tear down the system?" Caleb takes a deep breath, staring at the sea of faces in front of him. He knows that no matter how he answers, it won't be enough for some people, but he pushes through. "I never meant for my words to be taken out of context," he says, his voice steady but strained. "What I was trying to say was that the system, our schools, our government, the way we treat people, needs to change. I want to see a world where people aren't discriminated against because of the color of their skin or their economic status. I'm not calling for violence. I'm calling for justice." He looks around the room, searching for understanding in the faces before him. "I know some people don't agree with me, And I understand that. But if we don't speak out against what's wrong, nothing will ever change. The reporters murmur, but it's clear the damage has already been done. Some nod in agreement. Others continue to scribble down notes, waiting for their next opportunity to twist his words. As the conference wraps up, Caleb feels no relief. If anything, he feels more exposed than before. There's no way to erase the damage. No way to make the people who oppose him understand. As Caleb walks out of the press conference, he's met by Mr. Rodriguez, who's been at the back of the room, observing quietly. The teacher approaches him, offering a small smile. "You did good, Caleb," Mr. Rodriguez says, his voice low but sincere. "It's not easy standing up like that, especially when everyone's against you." Caleb glances at him, unsure of his next move. "I don't know if it matters anymore. It feels like I'm losing everything. My friends, my family. The whole town is turning on me." Mr. Rodriguez looks at him with understanding. "That's how it feels at the beginning. But trust me, the fight isn't over yet. You've got more people on your side than you think. Sometimes it takes a while for the truth to sink in." Caleb nods, the weight of the conversation heavy on him. He wants to believe Mr. Rodriguez, but the doubt still lingers. The next day, Caleb visits his father at the hospital again. His father's condition is improving, but he's still weak. Caleb sits by his side, his hands folded in his lap. His father looks at him, his expression softer than usual. "I saw the press conference," his father says quietly. "I'm proud of you, Caleb. You stood up for what you believe in, even when it wasn't easy. Even when people were trying to tear you down." Caleb looks up at his father, surprised by his words. "You're proud of me?" His father nods. "I may not agree with everything you're doing, but I see your heart. You want to make a difference. And that's more than I can say for most people in this town." Caleb swallows hard, the emotion building in his chest. "I just want to do something that matters. Something that helps people who need it." His father looks at him with a faint smile. "Then keep fighting, Caleb. But remember, even the strongest fights take their toll. Don't lose yourself in the fight. You're more than just this battle." Caleb nods, feeling a tear slip down his cheek. Maybe there was hope after all. Maybe, just maybe, he was doing the right thing. A few days later, Caleb receives a message from one of his old friends, Lucy. She's been quiet for weeks, but now, she reaches out with a simple message. "I've been thinking about what you said, and I'm sorry I didn't support you before. I get it now. I'm with you." It's a small victory, but for Caleb, it feels huge. A shift is happening, even if it's subtle. People are starting to listen. They're starting to understand. Caleb, standing outside the school, watching as a group of students gather in front of the building. They hold signs, some in support of Caleb, others calling for change. For the first time, he feels like he's part of something bigger than himself. The battle is far from over, but Caleb knows this. He's not alone anymore, and the path forward, while uncertain, is a path he's willing to walk, no matter what the cost. The atmosphere in the town has reached a fever pitch. Caleb's activism, once a source of inspiration for some, has now made him the focal point of a deepening divide. Protests are escalating, and tension between supporters and detractors is palpable. On one side, there are those who stand behind Caleb, advocating for justice, equality, and an end to systemic racism. On the other, there's a rising counterforce, composed of angry townspeople who view Caleb as a threat, a symbol of everything they fear. Caleb walks through the town square, surrounded by the growing crowd of protesters. The tension is electric. He knows it could all turn violent at any moment. In the distance, he sees members of a far-right group, known for their aggressive protests, moving toward the scene, their presence intimidating and filled with animosity. Caleb's phone buzzes with messages from his supporters, some urging him to back down, others telling him to stay strong. His heart races as the sounds of chanting grow louder. He catches a glimpse of Jake in the crowd, standing with a group of angry protesters. A man steps forward and starts shouting at Caleb. "You don't belong here, Caleb. This is our town. You're nothing but a troublemaker." The crowd starts to gather around Caleb, and he feels the weight of their hostility pressing in on him. He is acutely aware that this could spiral into something dangerous. As the situation intensifies, Caleb is escorted away by a few of his supporters, including Mr. Rodriguez, who appears at his side with a concerned look. "Caleb, you need to leave. It's not worth it," Mr. Rodriguez says, his voice full of urgency. Caleb hesitates, his gaze flicking between the hostile crowd and his friends. "I can't leave, not now. I've come this far." "This isn't the way, Caleb," Mr. Rodriguez insists, grabbing his arm gently. "If you stay here, this is going to turn ugly. You're not just fighting for yourself anymore. There's a bigger picture. Think about the consequences." But Caleb doesn't listen. "I have to keep fighting. I can't stop now. People are listening. I can feel it." Mr. Rodriguez shakes his head, disappointment in his eyes. Fighting for justice is one thing, but putting yourself in harm's way isn't the answer. You're going to have to find a different way to win this battle. At home, the tensions have reached a breaking point. Caleb's mother is beside herself, frantic about his safety. His father, though improving physically, is still deeply concerned about the path Caleb has chosen. "Caleb, this has gone too far," his father says, sitting up in his bed, his voice rough. "I understand you want to make a difference, but you're playing with fire. It's not worth it." "I don't care anymore," Caleb snaps, frustration bubbling over. "This town doesn't change unless someone fights for it, and if I don't, no one will." His mother, standing by the door, looks at him with a mixture of fear and sadness. "You can't fight the whole world, Caleb. Not like this. If you keep pushing, you're going to lose everything. You're already losing your friends. Your father is still recovering. And I'm scared." Caleb turns away, feeling suffocated by their concern. "I'm doing what's right. I'm doing what needs to be done." But the words feel hollow. Deep down, Caleb knows that the cost of this fight, his family's distress, his isolation, has become almost too high. That evening, the town square becomes a battleground. The far-right group marches in, chanting their own hateful slogans. The police, already stretched thin, struggle to maintain order as the two sides clash. Caleb stands at the front, facing the crowd, ready for whatever comes next. A man, wearing a leather jacket emblazoned with hateful symbols, pushes his way through the crowd and shoves Caleb. "You think you can change things? This is our town, not yours." He spits, and the crowd begins to stir. Caleb's heart races. He feels the weight of everyone's eyes on him, and for a brief moment, a terrifying thought crosses his mind. What if this is all pointless? What if everything he's fought for, every risk he's taken, has been in vain? But then, from the corner of his eye, Caleb sees something, a glimmer of support. A group of young people who had once avoided him now stand with him. They are holding signs, their eyes filled with determination. And then he sees Jeremiah, standing at the back of the crowd, his eyes calm but intense. He doesn't speak, but his presence is a silent reminder that Caleb's fight isn't just about him. It's about the people who have been silenced for far too long. With newfound resolve, Caleb stands tall. He steps forward, facing the man in the leather jacket, and says clearly, "This is our town too. We're not going anywhere." A murmur runs through the crowd. For the first time in weeks, Caleb feels like he's not alone. But the situation is still volatile. A shout rings out, and within seconds, the protest erupts into chaos. In the chaos, Caleb is knocked to the ground, his head hitting the pavement hard. For a moment, everything goes black. When he regains consciousness, he's being helped to his feet by Mr. Rodriguez and a few others. "Are you okay?" Mr. Rodriguez asks, his voice urgent. Caleb's vision is blurry, and his head throbs with pain. I think so." But as he looks around, the full weight of what's happening hits him. The streets are filled with violence, screams, sirens, and smoke. Caleb can't even tell who's on his side and who's not. Jeremiah steps up to him, his face drawn with concern. "Caleb, this isn't the way. People are getting hurt. You've got to stop." "I can't," Caleb replies, his voice barely a whisper. "I've come too far." But Jeremiah places a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "You're losing yourself, Caleb. This isn't you. It's never been about fighting for fighting's sake. You've got to stand for what's right, without destroying everything around you." The reality of the situation hits Caleb in waves. He's pushed so hard for change that he's forgotten the people he's supposed to be fighting for, those like Jeremiah, who have always known the cost of resistance. He looks at the destruction around him, the faces of people who are scared, and he begins to wonder if this was the outcome he'd always feared. Fighting so fiercely that he lost sight of what he was fighting for. The next morning, Caleb sits on the steps of his house, his face bruised, his body exhausted. He hasn't slept in days. The town is quiet, but the air is thick with tension. News of the violence from the previous night has spread. People are angry, scared, confused. He receives a call from Lucy. "Caleb, we can't let this go on. We need to get everyone together. Your supporters, the people who understand this cause, to do something peaceful. We can't fight fire with fire." Her words resonate deeply with Caleb. The fight for justice was never supposed to lead to violence, and yet, here they were. He takes a deep breath, realizing that the choice is his. "I hear you," he says quietly. "I've been so focused on this fight. I forgot why I started it in the first place." Caleb calls for one final rally, but this time, it's different. He and Lucy, along with Mr. Rodriguez, organize a march for peace. No violence, no anger, just a gathering of people who want change. The rally is small at first, but it slowly grows. Caleb stands at the front, but this time, he isn't shouting, he isn't fighting, he's standing in solidarity. The march goes peacefully. There are no shouts of hatred, no clashes. Caleb's heart swells with cautious hope as they make their way through the streets of the town, their voices unified, calling for justice. As the march ends in the town square, Caleb looks around at the faces gathered there. There is still a long way to go. Change won't come overnight. But in this moment, there is a sense of unity, a sense of possibility. Weeks pass. The town begins to slowly heal, but the change Caleb has fought for is far from complete. His relationships with his family, his friends, and the community are still fractured. But there's hope. Hope that the seed has been planted, that things can change. Caleb stands outside, looking at the town he's always known. The horizon is brighter now, but there's still work to be done. He knows the road ahead will be hard, but for the first time in a long while, he feels ready to face whatever comes next.